Section 5. China. The region that came to be known as China is filled with geographic extremes. In the south of the country, along the coast, a great deal of rain comes from monsoon season. This allows crops to thrive in the warmer months. The eastern side of the country is surrounded by water, the Yellow Sea and the Pacific Ocean to be exact. Two major river systems run through China. In the north, you'll find the Yellow River, and in the south, the Yangtze. In the western portion of the country are mountain ranges separating it from countries like India. In the north, the Gobi Desert stretches across much of the territory. The geographic features of this area allowed China to remain relatively isolated from the other ancient civilizations that sprang up during this era of world history. It also provided many challenges for the people who would eventually come to settle areas of the country. You'll learn about some of those challenges in this section. While little is known about ancient Chinese history, it is believed that people began to settle and build villages in the Huanghe River Valley around 5000 BCE. By 2000 BCE, some of the settlements there grew into the first cities in China. These cities needed formal leadership to keep them together, and as such, the first dynasty is said to have begun. Known as the Ch.3, much of what is known about this early dynasty is passed down in stories and legends, and there is less evidence in the form of archaeological records to point us toward what really happened during this time. Still, stories passed down from generation to generation can contain valuable information to help us answer the question, what happened? Much of what we think happened to found the Ch.3 dynasty comes from the legend of Yu. Settlements sprang up around the Yellow River, and it often flooded. This wasn't a problem native to China, as you've learned in other sections of this book. Still, one of the early leaders, King Yao, gave a man named Gun the task of finding a way to control the floodwaters. Gun failed many times at this task, seeking to build dams to trap the water. This did not stop the flooding from happening, and it wasn't Gun who ended up solving the problem. It was his son, Yu. Yu was able to carefully study the river systems and learn from his father's mistakes. Yu is credited as having created a system of irrigation canals which brought the floodwaters into fields over the period of approximately 13 years. Yu would eventually become ruler, and the Ch.3 dynasty continued for several hundred years. It is with the start of the Shang dynasty that we have a lot of historical evidence that helps us figure out what happened in this area during this time. The Shang rose to power in northern China and are said to have eventually conquered the Ch.3. During the Shang dynasty, China was ruled by a monarch who would appoint governors to rule small sections of the kingdom overall. It was also during the Shang dynasty that the Chinese began working with the metal bronze. The people of the Shang dynasty continued to live off the land settled earlier and continued to guard against flooding by further developing complex irrigation and flood control methods. Social classes rose to prominence during this era, with the king at the top and warrior nobles near the top with them. At the bottom of this social pyramid were the peasants and farmers who lived in the many villages around the territory. Family was central in early Chinese society. You'll learn more about religions and philosophies in the 5th chapter of this book. Eventually, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism would take hold in the country, but during this era, ancestor worship was important to the people of the dynasty. The Shang Chinese believed that the spirits of their ancestors were always watching them and would favor them with rewards or bring disaster depending on whether they were happy with them or not. Written language is thought to have begun prior to the Shang dynasty and wouldn't become standardized until the Qin dynasty. But development of it continued during this era. You're reading this book in English, where we have an alphabet containing 26 letters, all of which can be put together to make words, phrases, and sentences. The Chinese, however, have a pictographic language, which has thousands of characters to be learned. This written language has developed over time, but in the beginning it was made up of symbols that had looked somewhat like the thing being described. Take, for example, this picture of a tree. Now consider the Chinese character that represents the word tree. Can you see the similarities between the two? Many of the Chinese characters in their language were created based on the object it was trying to describe. describe. Unfortunately, however, this is relatively easy to do for something like a tree, but much more difficult for many other words. How would you represent the word yellow? The Shang dynasty, like the one rumored to have come before it, and the ones that would come after, eventually declined. Eventually, it was replaced by the Zhou dynasty, which was the first to introduce the idea that those in charge ruled by a mandate of heaven. This practice would be followed in all successive dynasties, with the main belief being that the ruler ruled with the blessing of heaven. If a ruler lost the blessing, natural disasters would occur, the royal family would be overthrown, and the new house would rule. This dynasty was never able to fully unify the entire territory, and this gave rise to city-states. Territories were governed by members of the royal family, and a system very similar to one that developed much later in Europe developed here. This system is called feudalism. Under feudalism, nobles are granted use of lands that belong to the king in return for service to the empire. The nobles then divided the land further into farms for extended families. Feudalism here and in Europe both share some of these characteristics. There were some very important developments technologically during this time period, however. Roads and canals were built to help with trade and farming. This also helped with the growth of cities. Money in the form of coins were created out of bronze. This also helped with the development of trade. The Zhou also learned how to work with iron. Population grew and farming techniques improved. This dynasty came to an end during a period known as the Period of Warring States, when the armies of the Qin captured the heart of the empire. You'll learn more about China later in this resource, as well as in high school world history.